afternoon, everyone. My name is Beatrice, and welcome to another episode of Regional Powerhouses, where we speak to experts and thought leaders on the pressing issues that affect the region and the world at large. Today, we're going to talk about an issue that's becoming an ever-increasing concern around the world: energy. We are currently facing an energy crisis. And right now, as I speak, I think half of Malaysia is having an electricity cut. So no matter where you are in the world, you would probably have seen your electricity bill going up and the price of goods increasing, as well as owing to the higher cost of energy. We are using more power than ever before. At the same time, there is a growing demand for cleaner, greener, more environmentally friendly energy. But the reality is that the so-called green options cannot match our demands, and besides, they may not be as green or as clean as we think. So what's the solution to this dilemma? Our guest today may just have one. Daniel Lewkovitz is the CEO and Chief Security Evangelist of Calamity Monitoring, a multi-award-winning security and life safety firm from Australia. More than that, Daniel is also a keen exponent of energy security, and today he will tell us why there is a readily available solution to the energy crisis, one that is safe, reliable, sustainable, green, and readily available. And all we need to do is to just stop being afraid and learn to embrace nuclear power. Joining me live from Sydney, Australia today to talk about why nuclear is the answer and to shed more light on himself, including his recent run as a candidate for the Wentworth division at the 2022 Australian general elections, here is Daniel Lewkovitz. Hi, Daniel.
Beatrice, what a pleasure to join you in a global audience.
Yes, a pleasure to have you on board and to have all your really introspective views on what energy can do for us, especially nuclear energy. So thank you for the honor of joining us.
We've you said in your intro how much energy we consume, and it's something that we take so for granted in our daily activities that people don't even consider about it.
Yes.
Every single person watching this is using energy.
Exactly.
The device that they're watching it on required energy to manufacture it. They're sitting in a room with the lights on. In Malaysia, the air conditioning will be running. In Sydney, the heating will be running.
Exactly.
It's something that powers literally every single thing that we do.
Exactly.
And because you take it for granted, like many things, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. But that's actually something that countries are now facing.
Absolutely.
And it's certainly, for me, it's a problem in a first world country. In developing nations, you know, maybe they're used to it, but they shouldn't be. And the thing that I've found so frustrating are governments that have actually put policies into place, ostensibly under a climate change agenda, that have effectively resulted in the lights going out. And that just simply shouldn't happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I totally am with you. So let me get you into your first question. Daniel, for all our readers here and our viewers here, you're a security evangelist. You're very concerned about energy security as well as being the CEO of Calamity Monitoring. You're also the Liberal Democrats candidate for Wentworth at the 2022 Australia general elections. Now, I have a strong suspicion that these are all connected. Would you care to connect the dots for me, if my suspicions are right?
Yeah, I think your suspicions are. I mean, I'm certainly a political outsider in Australia. Most of the people who are involved in politics at a regional and a national level here are career politicians. They're people who perhaps went straight from university into working for a member of parliament or in a parliamentary office, or perhaps a trade union, and they worked their way up the ladder and eventually they found themselves actually running as a candidate. The problem that I've always had as a business owner is that you have people in political power telling everybody how to run their business and coming up with policies that impact their business. But these are people who've never actually run a business. They've never owned a business. And yet, despite having zero first-hand experience of these things, they're telling the rest of us how to live their lives. And
sheer insanity, isn't it?
And it's something that, you know, I and most business leaders in this country simply put up with for the longest time, because look, we pay far too much tax in this country. We have far too much bureaucracy in this country, but it's still a nice country to live. We have a great standard of living. It's a wonderful country of which I'm very proud. But the impact of some of these policies during the pandemic and the effect that these had, not just on businesses but on families, on individuals, was too much for me to bear. And I'm not the sort of person to sit on the sidelines grumbling and complaining. I tend to put up my hand and say, right, here's a problem. What are we going to do to fix it? So that's why I actually put my hand up to enter politics. Now, you referred to Wentworth, which is the political district in which I was running as a candidate, and that covers some of the wealthiest parts of real estate in Sydney, around Sydney Harbour, and so forth. And for all intents and purposes, it was a completely unwinnable challenge for me. But it's winning wasn't actually the sole desire. One of the things that I wanted to do as part of running was, first of all, to encourage other business owners and encourage other high achieving individuals to actually consider going into politics rather than simply sitting on the sidelines and suffering as a result of underperforming people going into politics. But the second thing I wanted to do, well and truly, was to get nuclear energy onto the national agenda. Now, this wasn't a political issue prior to the election. It was probably an election where, even though we just come out of a pandemic, the biggest issue was probably climate change, gender diversity issues, and all of these sort of soft issues that were almost like as though the pandemic and the impact of that hadn't happened. But I actually forced the issue. One of the traditions in Australia during elections, and probably many other countries, is candidates put posters up on all the telegraph poles around town advertising them. Now, the area in which I was running, one of the suburbs there, the local government, or the council as it's called, had put signs on the telegraph pole saying that Waverley is a nuclear-free zone. And I think you have that photograph. You might want to put it up on the screen.
Right.
And so they put that sign up there saying Waverley is a nuclear-free council, and this is something that they would have once upon a time done, to try and impress the green or the environmentally conscious people in the area. But I thought that was really stupid. So I actually put my own sign on top, literally saying that sign is stupid. And you probably can't read it, but I basically described myself as the nuclear option for Wentworth. And so I was the only political candidate that actually had signs up during the election demanding that we talk about nuclear. Now, before the election, both major parties didn't have the guts to actually talk about nuclear energy at all. However, now that the election's over, they're actually talking about it. So, I take full credit for getting it on the national agenda, and at least finally we're talking about it. And we're doing that in this country whilst the lights are probably still on, but electricity prices are rising daily. That's impacting the cost of living. There was a horrendous story just earlier this week where a migrant refugee family from Iran very nearly died. They were in their house. It was freezing cold. It's been very cold here lately. And they lit a charcoal burner inside the house, and were unconscious from carbon monoxide poisoning. And it was just a sheer miracle that they were actually found and rescued. But that's something that shouldn't happen, and the reason that's happening is because people here are now being forced to choose between putting food on the table or turning on the heater at night. And in Australia, we are sitting on so much of the world's energy. We have something like 30% of the world's uranium. We don't use it. We sit back while the rest of the world enjoys our uranium. We have so much coal here. We have so much gas here. And there's political and commercial interests and activists that actually want to see all of that stay in the ground, because it's not something they make money from. And it's really just the little people that are paying for that. And that's not right.
Absolutely. You were quoted as saying the renewables become landfill in a few years, correct, Daniel?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there's probably two relevant areas there. The first one is, well, when we talk about renewables, it's generally referring to wind and solar. Now, solar panels and wind turbines have a relatively short lifespan. It's between 10 and 20 years, and certainly in Australia, it's to the lower end of that because we have a fairly harsh environment, the sun, the wind, and so forth. When wind turbines become decrepit, they can't be recycled. They essentially, they just rust and they go to landfill. And solar panels.
Why can't they be recycled? Is there a reason why they can't be recycled?
Oh, look, that's probably beyond my high school chemistry, but it's my understanding that they're just one of those things that don't really lend themselves, to easy reuse. Not to mention the fact that the lifespan of them is relatively limited. I mean, a coal power plant has a 50 to 100 year lifespan. Nuclear power, 50 to 70 years straight out of the box, and then more if you do, ongoing maintenance. But the other thing with solar panels is that the metals and the chemicals that are used and the components that go into its manufacture, have to be removed and pulled out of it. It's a bit like, if you throw away computer waste or any other form of electronic waste. And the thing is, that's an extremely costly and difficult process. So, what a lot of companies and even nations are doing is they're just kind of dumping it to landfill, or perhaps they're sending it off to the third world where people in developing nations are pulling these chemicals out at huge personal risk. I mean, you're dealing with very dangerous chemicals, but in very round terms, it's been worked out that solar produces about 300 times the waste of nuclear. Now, you'll often hear people talk about nuclear waste without realising how minimal the waste from a modern nuclear reactor actually is. But what you don't hear people talking about is what comes out of solar. And one of the things that I find incredibly frustrating is the activist language that surrounds wind and solar, for example, referring to it as clean energy. And there's two problems with that. The first thing is there's nothing at all clean about solar panels that end up going to landfill, and the metals from that leach out and they go into local water sources and they poison they poison people. That's the first thing. But the second thing is wind and solar are an inherently unreliable generating source. Solar, of course, because the sun doesn't always shine, and certainly the weather we've had over the last few weeks, not only does it not shine at night, it doesn't shine much during the day either. And of course, wind, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, or sometimes the wind actually blows so hard that they have to turn the turbines off to stop them ripping themselves apart. So it's inherently unreliable. So of course, what people will then say, oh, well, that's okay, we can use a battery as part of that. Now, first of all, batteries have a fixed lifespan. But also batteries don't produce electricity, they don't generate electricity, they only store it. But of course, batteries also contain metals and chemicals and so forth. And, one of those is cobalt. And some of the largest cobalt mines in the world are in Central Africa, where they have these artisanal mines where young children, as young as 6 years old, are going into these mines and actually mining for the cobalt. So, when you have child slave labor producing this stuff, for someone in a rich first world country to talk about that as clean energy, really upsets me, because you not only have something that's fundamentally unclean, like solar panels going to landfill, but you actually have child slave labor. And also a lot of that stuff is manufactured by slaves in countries such as China as well. So when you've got slave labor and child slave labor, that's not clean at all. And anyone who calls it that, I think, is just deliberately choosing not to look at where these things come from. And, that's not right.
Yeah. Why is that this rush for it then? If they know this, I mean, it's obvious. Why are they rushing for it when you have nuclear? And why the fight against nuclear and for solar and wind?
Well, that's an amazing question, and I think the answer to that, like so many things, would be to follow the money. There are multi-billionaires who made a fortune on mining coal. There's a new generation of potential billionaires who stand to make a fortune from from wind and solar. And one of the things that I'm mindful of is that if you stood to make a few $billion off something, would you throw a few $1 million at marketing it? Yes, you probably would. Would that mean funding political candidates? Yes, it would. Would that mean funding educational programs or trying to convince an entire generation that that your solution is the good one? Yes, you probably would. But as to the question of why nuclear is not being discussed, well, I think it just comes from a general lack of awareness. Now, one thing that I should make very clear, I'm by no means an expert in nuclear energy, but when I started looking into this several years ago, and I wanted to know, look, what's it all about? I said, why aren't we talking about it here? And there's plenty of other countries that are using it. Why aren't we talking about it? And the more I started to actually look into it, the more I realized, first of all, I didn't know any of this stuff because no one here tells you these things.
Yeah, that's the whole problem, yeah.
But two, it's futuristic technology. I mean, this is space age stuff. It is effectively an energy source that never stops. It is completely low emissions, and it works 24/7. So, the rational side of it for me is simply, if you are convinced that climate change is caused by emissions and emissions are caused by coal-fired energy production, then why wouldn't you switch to something that generates electricity in abundance 24 hours a day and doesn't produce the emissions? And that's nuclear. Now, when I ask people who are, probably, 40 or older, what do you think about nuclear? A lot of the time, the cases that they will bring up are the reason, they're scared of it. So they might, for example, bring up Chernobyl, or they might talk about Fukushima. Yeah, that's another good example. And I thought, okay, well, look, my profession in security and risk management lets me look at risk. And one of the things that risk professionals know is that you can't eliminate risk. There's always going to be some risk, and that may mean people get hurt, people die, bad things happen. And so if you take, say, a risk perspective looking at COVID, you can work out were some of the things that we did for COVID worthwhile or not. You could look at everything from driver safety to building security to military and law enforcement, and you're essentially looking at the return on security investment. And some risks you just have to kind of live with. But so I looked at all of this, and I came across something called the death print. So it's like a footprint or a fingerprint, but the death print is the number of deaths per kilowatt hour caused by various forms of energy. So it's probably not a surprise to see that coal on average is the highest. So I'm just reading. I mean, there was a fantastic summary of this in Forbes. This was about 10 years ago, but it said that for every trillion kilowatt hours, about 100,000 people die as a result of coal. Now, that'll be two things. It'll obviously be people who die in coal mines and production there, but it's also people who die of related lung disease and so forth. So that might be 41% globally. It'll be 75% in China. And only 32% in the US, because the US has, a lot of legislation around clean air and so forth that China doesn't have. So right at the top, you've got coal. And look, that's no real surprise. I think most people would like to see us move away from coal just because, it produces so many emissions. But then down the bottom, you've got nuclear. And when I say the bottom, I mean the bottom. That is to say that hydroelectricity and wind and solar has killed more people than nuclear. And I didn't believe it when I saw it. And when I mention this to people, they don't understand it. They say, how can nuclear be safer than wind? And well, the answer is simple. People installing solar, they fall off rooftops. People installing wind, they fall down off the towers. People building hydroelectric dams, they get killed during that construction. But when we look at all of the people who have died during these sort of events that we talk about, Chernobyl, Fukushima, well, it's only in the dozens at Chernobyl, And let me be clear, if you don't want another Chernobyl, don't get the Soviets to build your nuclear reactor. I mean, to worry about nuclear safety today because of something that happened then would be like a person refusing to fly in an Airbus A380 because DC-8 aircraft used to crash in the 80s. But it was only a few dozen people, despite all of the hype surrounding it.
Right.
3 Mile Island in the US, even fewer than that. But Fukushima, which is the most recent example, is a really good one because about 1,000 people died in the tsunami, about 1,000. And that's the number that you hear thrown around. However, not a single person, not one, died as a direct result of radiation from the reactor. Literally not one person.
What did they die of?
Okay, so the people who died, it was a result of the evacuation itself. So it was, for example, seniors who got evacuated from aged care centres and died of dehydration, or they starved to death. There were various other, there were car crashes and things like that. So, there's a lot of people who are saying that, if they hadn't evacuated, nobody would have died. And the other thing to me that's very interesting is, Japan seems like the worst possible place to put one of these things because, they have earthquakes, they have tsunamis. Now, we don't have earthquakes or tsunamis in large sections of Australia. They do, but yet despite that, the technology was so safe that nobody died. Now, Japan is now expanding their nuclear program considerably.
Daniel, that's the thing which is very confusing because after Fukushima, it was the media made it look like it was the most dangerous place to be, Japan. So no one wanted to go there because of the radiation. They said you have to wait X number of years before you can even go back to Japan. So that was just so wrong. How did that happen? I mean, if now, as you say, none of them died due to the radiation, the way it was propagated was that it was such a dangerous place. Japan itself, because of Fukushima, was a dangerous place to be.
Well, Beatrice, if you've been paying attention to the media over the last few years, you'd probably know that, as they say, if it bleeds, it leads. And, fear and catastrophe, seems to sell more papers than just saying, everything is absolutely fine. So, yes, you're absolutely right.
So that must be part of the marketing plan, part of the marketing fund for the solar, wind and guys, right?
Well, look, it suits them. I mean, it suits them for people. If you ask a lot of people, where they get their understanding of nuclear energy, it's no exaggeration to say a lot of people get it from watching The Simpsons and seeing, a bumbling idiot like Homer Simpson, working at a nuclear plant that occasionally has, a meltdown for comedic effect, but they've never actually studied. I mean, funnily enough, because I've sort of looked into this every single day now, Google assumes I have an interest in nuclear energy, so it just pops up some new development in the field, and so I'm reading about like small modular reactors and fusion generation, and it's going to get to the point where apartment buildings are going to have a small nuclear reactor in the basement of that building, and meanwhile in this country, Australia, supposedly a first world nation, we're getting really excited about technology that a time traveller from the 7th century would recognise if they got here tomorrow, because that time traveller from the year 700 who, just got off a donkey's back would go, oh, I recognise that, that's a windmill, and we're putting that in and getting excited about it rather than this future stuff. I mean, the other thing is Japan, because of how World War II ended, Japan has about 250,000 reasons to hate all things nuclear, right?
Yeah.
But they don't, and so nuclear energy is coming. The Prime Minister there has said he wants to have 9 nuclear reactors up and running by the end of the year. China is planning on building 150 nuclear reactors. I mean, this is also a problem for Australia because we make a lot of money, selling our coal to the rest of the world. And I mean, sure, there's people who would love to see us stop doing that without realising how, coal sales benefit, this country. But countries are looking for energy independence.
Yeah.
And I think the war in Ukraine has sort of started making people realize that. I mean, since the 1980s, for example, France, hugely reduced their emissions of greenhouse gases by moving to a lot of nuclear, generation, and their cost of generation has come down so low that they're now, a net exporter of it. And again, coming back to, the media or activist groups sort of choosing what they want to tell you. So, you'll hear a lot of people saying, Germany are closing down their nuclear plants. And so that's used as an argument against nuclear. But there's 2 points that people don't want you to know. The first one is it's easy for them to do that because they can buy electricity from their next door neighbour in France who has plenty of nuclear power. In Australia, we can't do that. We can't ask the neighbours for electricity because there's a great big ocean in the world. So France is exporting their energy to the tune of about $4 or $5 billion a year, whereas of course Germany, who bet the house on green schemes, is now in chaos. I mean, Angela Merkel basically did a deal with the devil, and to get the support of the Green Party there, essentially vowed no more nuclear, closing down coal. And Germany, who sort of since the war have become probably one of the greatest manufacturing powerhouses on earth. The lights are literally going out there. So you can see the insanity of these approaches, and you're seeing it elsewhere in Europe, where on the one hand they're saying, Russia is terrible and Russia is our enemy, but on the other hand they're going to Russia and saying, and also can we please have your energy?
And nothing makes sense anymore. And that brings me to my next question. If nuclear energy is safe and cheap and is environmentally friendlier than even solar energy, why is nuclear energy illegal in Australia?
Well, that's an outstanding question. I mean, again, some of the critics of nuclear here, well, I shouldn't even say the critics of nuclear, but some of the people who are so rusted onto wind and solar, they've just been brainwashed into supporting it, will often say, nuclear is too expensive and it takes too long to build. Well, first of all, that's in many cases not correct. But even if it were correct, well, that doesn't matter. That's a problem for the market to sort out.
Exactly.
I mean, they'll say things like, well, no one's going to invest in nuclear. Well, of course no one's going to invest in it because it's illegal. It would be like investing in a heroin manufacturing plant. No legitimate business is going to do that because it's illegal. But if you lift the prohibition on it, then you can actually see what happened. I mean, the former government here decided to procure nuclear-powered submarines, and I mean, although that may take many years to actually eventuate, there wasn't a lot of controversy about it. I think people sort of understood it, and I think nuclear power could be a discussion that we are now ready to have. I mean, interestingly, when you talk to young people, and I certainly did that during the campaign. These are young kids who care very deeply about the environment, and I think to some extent some of their ideas are a little bit misguided. They've been sort of force fed a catastrophic agenda, and a lot of them actually believe the world's going to end in 10 years, and it's essentially feeding childhood anxiety. But the interesting thing is, when you talk to them about nuclear, they're not terrified of it. They're not scared about it. They don't know much about it because they're not being taught this stuff. But when you look at sort of an older generation, they were either worried about Chernobyl or Fukushima because they just haven't sort of heard the whole story, or perhaps they're worried about nuclear waste, and people sort of conjure up this image of radioactive monsters sort of glowing in the dark and huge craters in the middle of the desert that are glowing, and it's just not the case. A modern nuclear reactor produces so little waste that it can be stored in a shed in the car park of the nuclear reactor. And if you took the waste from every nuclear reactor in the entire world and you stacked it all up, it wouldn't even fill a football stadium. So,
Wow.
I mean, we have enough space in the middle of central Australia that the entire world of nuclear waste could go there, and nobody would even know about it. And of course, modern nuclear reactors, they not only produce less waste, they're actually able to recycle much of the waste. So, I mean, I think, France's reactors, and they're not even the newest technology, but something like 17% of their energy actually comes from recycled, nuclear waste. So the technology advances, but basically all the excuses you hear why it's a bad idea are just excuses.
Yeah.
And I suspect a lot of that fear, uncertainty, doubt, or just ignorance is being fueled by the wind and solar investors who stand to make a fortune, even though they're selling something that can't possibly scale to generate the amounts of electricity that we need.
Wow. Wow. Unbelievable. Why is that being allowed? Why would they get their way? I mean, wouldn't governments want to do what is best for their citizens and for their productivity?
Well, there's the billion-dollar question, I suppose, and it's certainly what guided my entry into politics, because I felt that we don't have politicians that take a long-term view. They look as far as the next election. I mean, one of the other questions would come down to the various forms of corruption that happen in political schemes, and there's an interesting, I suppose, situation in Australia, which is if you move around, European, Middle Eastern, Asian nations, you'll be aware of corruption, and in many cases, it's widespread and it's quite rampant. But everybody knows it's there, and everybody understands how it works. In this country, we have it as well, but we like to kid ourselves that it doesn't exist. So, you have massive political donations that buy favours. You have, investment schemes, and look, you see it overseas as well. I mean, from his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, I mean, Al Gore has made an absolute fortune out of, pushing a lot of this content. And to me, it's almost like a sort of a reverse Robin Hood, where there are certain people who get a whole lot of money, and they're basically taking it from the poorest people who are going to struggle to pay for this energy. And when I say pay for this energy, I'm not just talking about their electricity bill. I'm talking about the cost of every single thing they buy, the food at the supermarket, the fuel that goes in the car, the products that they buy, the clothes that they wear. All of that requires energy in its production. So as energy costs go up to essentially line the pockets of some of these people, it's going to be the poorest members of our society who suffer. And to me, that's just not right.
Of course. Is there any chance you think that this making nuclear energy illegal is going to be overturned and we'll be able to see nuclear energy in Australia?
Look, it's my hope that happens, because a modern nuclear plant can be built in between 5 and 7 years, but I mean, I guess if it's our first, let's call it 10 years, and we could probably be spending 2 to 3 years sort of arguing about it before we even get to the start line. So the longer we put this off, the longer it's going to take. And, again, there are all sorts of competing interests. I mean, you've got people saying, it's going to take 10 years to put in, a nuclear plant, but, we have to save the earth, and we can put in wind and solar right now. Well, of course they're going to say that, aren't they? And it's in their interests to keep sort of kicking the can down the road as long as they could. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we could also have coal-fired production or gas-fired production much sooner if we had the political will to do that. But unfortunately, we also have people here who genuinely believe that, burning coal in Australia is causing heat waves in London. So it's very, very difficult to have a rational argument with people who have irrational beliefs that are approaching almost
who believe in the
a religious it's a religious level of zeal, as opposed to any sort of analytical, critical thinking that might allow them to actually realize things make sense, even as a short-term process.
I agree with you. Daniel, Australia is one of the world's largest deposit holders of thorium. And thorium is only enriched to uranium-233, which means it does not fall under the NPT category and is safe to use in developing countries. Thorium molten salt reactors can be built in under 5 years, which makes it shorter than nuclear. Production of cheap energy helps reduce poverty significantly, as you just said. Yet we don't really hear much about this form of energy. Why is it, you think?
Well, I mean, look, again, I'm not an expert in all things nuclear, but I mean, thorium is certainly a good example of the future of where this technology is headed, because it can't be weaponized as easy as other forms of energy. Now, I should say there's no particular threat of, terrorists, the bad guys, attacking nuclear plants and stealing the material from there, but it's more that you have countries, Iran would be a good example, where under the pretense of a civilian nuclear energy scheme, they could actually be developing weapons grade nuclear materials. So, certain other utilities, thorium, for example, make that harder or impossible. But every day there's new technologies emerging. I mean, fusion, which may or may not be something that happens in our lifetime, is also, even further safe than the existing already safe technology. So, these things are always growing. But again, I think part of the distraction is that if you're always talking about the next best thing, it sort of stops you looking at the incumbent technology and saying, let's do that. So, I mean, I'm seeing that in Australia now. There are people getting excited about small modular reactors. Well, they're certainly an emerging technology, but there's no reason why we couldn't also, and I'm going to use a bit of Australian slang here, we couldn't also, just build a big ass generator, running on, slightly older generation hardware, because that works, rather than going, oh well, let's wait for the new thing. At some point you've just got to
do it.
Get on with it. And that's what we really must be doing. And when I look at some of the countries that are going down the nuclear route, certainly some of our neighbouring countries. I mean, these are countries where in Australia, we would look at them as developing nations, but they're putting that in, and here in Australia, we're just sitting on our backsides and not putting it in, and it's just embarrassing where some really dysfunctional countries still manage to actually pull this off very safely and very productively, and we don't even want to talk about it. And so what I want to be doing is getting all of our leaders to actually talk about it. I want our population talking about it. I want us demanding that we get the clock started on building this stuff and having it ready to go, because I shudder to think what happens when energy costs become unaffordable here, or when the lights go out, and some of the really wealthy people who are pushing for this stuff, they're not going to be the ones impacted by this. It's not going to affect them if their expenses for everything go up a few dollars. It's going to affect people who don't have a voice, people who don't have the ability to engage in politics, to engage in debate. And I want to speak on behalf of those people and make sure that their lights are going to get kept on. I mean, we have so much energy in this country, literally sitting under our feet, that we could have a situation where no one here in Australia ever needs to see an electricity bill again. And you could imagine, the impact that could have on manufacturing, on production, on transport. But, instead we're paying money hand over fist to subsidise, wind and solar, and a lot of people are making a whole lot of money out of it. And it can't possibly work. And we're not talking about things that can work. And I mean, to me, that is crazy.
Your points are extremely valid. I totally agree with you. I think you made a great case, Daniel. And I would like our viewers to know a little bit more about you. Were you a businessman who went into politics, or a politician who dabbles in business? Tell us your backstory, Daniel.
Oh, very, very much the former. I mean, I own a business called Calamity, and we are a security and life safety business. And you probably can't see it in this little box on the screen, but I'm 2 meters tall, or 6'6". I'm a pretty big guy, and that's how I fell into security. But my focus now is very much electronics. So it's cameras, it's analytics, AI-based video monitoring, alarms, looking after seniors in their home, keeping people safe. And Essentially, that's what I've done my whole career. I've protected people. And so the entry into politics was really an extension of that. It was about protecting people. It was about protecting businesses. It was about protecting the nation, giving us the resilience that we need to actually go into some pretty scary times, having just come from some and seen some really preventable failures here. So that's why I put my hand up for politics. And there's not a tradition here of business leaders going into politics. Generally, business leaders would run in the opposite direction, and I want to see that change, because I want to see a real talent pool of capable people going into politics, and that way we can get much better outcomes rather than just relying on voting for the least worst option at every election.
Yes. Well, I applaud your passion, and I think you're one of the rare breed of people who really walk the talk, Daniel. So it's such a pleasure having you on board. I think you're an inspiration to a lot more, and I think many more of us are going to be doing exactly what you do. Just take the problem in your hand and go out there and try to solve it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I think that's I think that's essential, because there's a calm, sensible way that we can have these discussions, and that's a political format. Because I've seen what happens when people who don't have a voice finally get fed up. I mean, you have political decisions that can see, millions of people marching in the streets, or buildings getting set on fire, or, trucks blocking roads, and, people getting hurt and rioting and so forth. And that's not something that I want to see. But in order for us to avoid that, a few things need to happen. First of all, you need talented people who aren't afraid to speak their mind. You need people to have the ability to listen to differing opinions, and you don't always have to agree, but you have to listen to other points of view and find the bits of those points of view with which you do agree. Because we live in a world of cancel culture and instant outrage, and people sort of want to see opposing views blocked, banned, silenced, rather than listening to them and perhaps having an exchange of ideas, which is once upon a time how a society advanced. And that's really what we need. But I mean, for me, it was a case of, look, you can either rock the boat or you go down with the ship, and there's no point complaining. And so I fall, very much into the first category, and that's really why I put my hand up, and why I'll continue to protect people, and I'll continue to help people, and I'll continue to try and do things that will advance this nation, and what's good for us will be good for the rest of the world as well.
Well, amen to that, Daniel. So thank you so much for coming on to our show. Follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website to keep up to date with our upcoming shows. And let's give you a big hand of applause wherever we are for Daniel Lewkovitz and his wonderful, wonderful explanation of why he's making a case for not just nuclear energy, for the world, in fact, for something that's better for the common man. Because it's ultimately the common man. The Voice of ASEAN thanks you, Daniel. We thank you for your time. We thank you for the opportunity and the honor of having you on board. And we'll be uploading a recorded version of this dialogue in our portal for those who missed it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.